Okay, we're going to start the portion of our unit that's called Segregation and Jim Crow Law. Before I go any further, I want you to know that I have included at the top of Unit 2 the sheet from the student workbook that has the notes you need to be able to do any of the assignments. Segregation and Jim Crow starts right after the Civil War, right after Reconstruction ends. The South is very quickly going to go back to their old ways. Now, constitutionally, they can't go all the way back, but they can do things that can specifically limit freedoms. And that's what's going to happen. It's not going to just apply to African Americans, although they will be our primary example. Racial segregation, let's break it apart. Racial means based on race. Segregation means we are going to separate you based on race. It's going to be used primarily against African Americans. We are going to include other groups. The Chinese. Now, the Chinese were originally brought here in the 1860s and 1870s to help build the Transcontinental Railroad. But because of high distrust of Chinese people in the western states, Congress is going to pass a law called the Chinese Exclusion Act in 1882, which is going to provide an absolute 10-year ban, moratorium, halt, whatever you want to say, on Chinese labor immigration. The Chinese Exclusion Act is going to stay around until the 1940s, but we will get to that at a different point in time. American Indians are also not going to be considered citizens until 1924. And as the settling of the West goes on, they too are going to be segregated into reservations. Jim Crow laws. Now, these were mostly passed in the South. Jim Crow refers to a minstrel character who was usually a white person dressed in blackface and playing a fool. So, obviously, an insult to any black American. They're going to be passed to discriminate. They're going to make all kinds of things legal to do in communities and states, primarily in the South. They're going to limit where people can live, where they can work, where they can go to school, and how they interact with the government. It's going to get very, very extreme. The Jim Crow laws are the foundation, but there's a whole set of habits and behaviors and rules that if you were a white person, a black person in the South, you knew not to follow. That you were things that just not weren't going to do. You weren't going to walk on the same sidewalk as a white person when they walked by. You weren't going to acknowledge a white person unless they acknowledged you first. You sure as heck were not going to speak to a white woman. All of these things could lead to lots of problems for you. All of this is going to be built on a foundation of a Supreme Court decision in 1896 called Plessy versus Ferguson, in which the Supreme Court is going to create a concept simply called separate but equal. The idea was that it would be perfectly okay to have separate facilities for blacks and whites as long as they were equal. Now, in the case of Plessy, he was just wanting to ride in the white railroad cars on the train. Plessy happened to be 1/8 black. But under the rules of the South at that time, if you were 1/8 black, you were considered black. So when they wouldn't let him, he sued the railroad. The case goes all the way to the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court argues, well, there are separate cars for blacks and whites. They're the same kind of cars. So therefore, separate but equal is perfectly allowable. The problem is, in a society where one group of people controls the money and how it's going to be spent, are facilities going to be separate and equal? If I'm running a school system and I have control of spending money, am I going to spend money on the schools that benefit my family and my friends or the people I don't know? And in the case of the black Southerners, most white Southerners did not know black people. So therefore, they really weren't overly concerned about their health and well-being. So we understand and are clear. Separate but equal Jim Crow laws are going to be the law of the land from 1896 until 1954. It's going to take 20 years after 1954 to see things completely change. But this is where we're going to be until we get to the Civil Rights Union at the end of the year. Now, don't ever think for 1 second that there was not discrimination in the North, black against white. The difference was it wasn't based in law, it was based in practice. This is how we've always done it. There weren't a lot of laws, but yes, there was racism north and south.